You're listening to Just Medicine, an equity in healthcare podcast created by medical students in British Columbia.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Just Medicine podcast. My name is Kennedy, and I'm a first-year medical student at the University of British Columbia. As you probably know, Just Medicine is an equity in healthcare podcast aiming to provide insight in social justice topics as they pertain to health, as well as equipping listeners with the knowledge and tools to advocate for a range of patient needs. The episodes that I'll be contributing to the platform focus on diet, food sovereignty, and the gut microbiome. In particular, this podcast series examines how access to foods, culturally appropriate foods, is incredibly important for the gastrointestinal health and overall health of Indigenous populations in British Columbia. This topic is one that I've been really interested in since right before medical school and now continuing into my medical degree, combining my passions for Indigenous health advocacy, food equity, and the field of gastroenterology. I actually recently attended a film screening of Let Them Eat Dirt based on a book by two UBC researchers explaining how our body's microbiome, or the microbes that live in and on us, influence childhood development as well as key disease processes into adulthood like obesity, diabetes, and asthma. This got me thinking specifically about the gut microbiome and how the diets we consume affect those microbes. Today's episode, the first episode in a 4-part series, promises to lay the groundwork for us to understand the significance of food, land, and tradition in Indigenous communities. We'll also discuss how colonization has forced people to disconnect from their environments, which have led to changing diets and adverse health and social outcomes. To start us off, let's talk about food access. There are increasing numbers of people across Canada who don't have control over their own diets. This presents a problem since diet has such a significant impact on health outcomes. According to a recent Statistics Canada study, nearly 20% of British Columbians face food insecurity, meaning for one reason or another, they don't have enough safe, nutritious, or culturally acceptable food to eat. In British Columbia, your average citizen who tends to be at a higher risk of experiencing food insecurity may come from a single-parent family, be a recent immigrant, or live with a disability. Now, compare that 20% number in the general population with the percentage of folks in Indigenous communities who experience food insecurity, and it's disproportionately higher. Between 48% and 55% of Indigenous folks in coastal and Vancouver Island, as well as the interior First Nations communities, suffer from food insecurity. That number is staggering, and you might be wondering why. First, there are a number of financial reasons for food insecurity, including low income, high cost of living, underemployment, and health issues straining household budgets. People are struggling financially, yet the cost of food is only going up. And across Canada, this cost is 2 to 3 times higher in areas more than 50 kilometers away from a major urban center. Now, given historical mistreatment and marginalization, Indigenous folks more commonly experience the factors I just mentioned. In particular, 25% of Indigenous peoples aged 19 to 45 live in remote areas of Canada with these higher food prices, compared with just 3% of the non-Indigenous population. Among the Indigenous identities, Inuit and First Nations individuals were most likely to be remote. With that being said, although financial barriers are considered to be important risk factors, food insecurity exists for other reasons you may not expect. For example, a lack of food access, whether that's geographic isolation, so a grocery store that's too far away, expensive, and understocked, or an inability to harvest foods from traditional lands because of colonial restrictions and environmental changes. Another example is a lack of knowledge about cooking practices, nutrition, and budgeting. If you don't have the skills to cook meals with certain ingredients or to reinvent leftovers, you can be left with food and dollars wasted. As we'll discuss later in the episode, many Indigenous communities have their own specific harvesting and cooking practices associated with land and food, respectively. These practices are taught and passed down through generations. For example, as Jessie touches upon in our interview, families may get together to go fishing. As part of that process, children may learn about how to preserve their catch or learn how traditional food systems can be used to manage salmon supply for sustainability. Unfortunately, intergenerational bonds were intentionally severed through colonization, with policies that created residential schools and reserves, facilitated the 60s scoop, and so much more. So many young Indigenous folks were cut off from knowledge holders who could have taught them about cooking, food, and waste. Not only this, but families were separated from their traditional lands and waterways where they would have otherwise been able to hunt or gather. As you can see, food insecurity amongst Indigenous communities in Canada is a multifaceted issue, deeply rooted in both financial constraints and systemic barriers. The historical marginalization and mistreatment of Indigenous individuals have exacerbated these challenges, severing intergenerational knowledge transfer and limiting access to traditional lands and resources. As we delve further into this topic throughout our conversations in the podcast series, I'd like for listeners to think about how they can recognize and address these underlying causes to create sustainable solutions that honor and restore the cultural practices or food systems of Indigenous communities. Now, with that in mind, I wanted to speak briefly to food sovereignty. This means making sure that food is not just considered available, but also considered nutritious and culturally appropriate. As well, food sovereignty often involves allowing a community itself to create their own mechanisms and policies of food production and distribution. This is not yet happening. As a result, diet is changing in Indigenous communities to become more westernized. Interestingly, there's a consensus amongst scientific experts that more traditional diets are of higher quality, tending to promote healthier, more diverse gut microbiomes. In fact, researchers are looking to study non-westernized populations in order to understand the therapeutic properties of good bacteria lineages that have been lost from many westernized human populations. This points to even more reasons why it's not just important, but necessary to promote food sovereignty in Indigenous communities, where people have control over their land, grazing, water, seeds, livestock, and fish populations. That way, they can use these resources in the way they see fit, potentially consuming diets more similar to tradition and in an environmentally sustainable way. All in all, there are numerous reasons why Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected by food insecurity and associated health disparities. The question now becomes, how do we move forward? How do we advocate for reconnecting Indigenous youth to tradition, culture, and community? How do we create food sovereignty, and how is this different from food security? These are all questions I was able to talk through with Jessie during our interview together. Jessie Newman is Haida, Heiltsuk, and Kwakwakiwak and grew up on Skidegate in Haida Gwaii. She works as an Indigenous Health Dietitian for Island Health, mainly in the north of Vancouver Island and in some communities on the mainland, where she's built a wealth of experiences, both personal and professional. Jessie does both public health and community work, with a focus on advocacy for food sovereignty, diabetes prevention and management, and education for young people in schools. Through our conversation, I got to know Jessie as an inspiring health professional and human being with a clear passion for supporting and empowering those around her, especially doing so within very complex health and social systems. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with Jessie for 2 podcast episodes, the first of which you'll hear today, mainly focusing on why things are the way they are when it comes to colonial policy, land, food, and Indigenous health. It'll also lay the groundwork for us to discuss the following over the course of the podcast series. First, diet's role in creating and influencing the gut microbiome. Second, advocacy for systemic change to lessen the prevalence of food insecurity. Third, the importance of relationship when counseling for dietary changes, especially for Indigenous folks. And fourth, next steps for listeners. I'm excited to share with you all our interview together, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. So, welcome, Jessie. It's fantastic to have you on the Just Medicine podcast today. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Kennedy. I'm excited to be here.
Of course, I can't wait to get to know you more and to dive into your expertise on such important topics. Topics like colonial policy, land access, food sovereignty, and look more at how they impact BC's Indigenous communities. So without further ado, let's get started. So to begin, Jessie, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you?
Sure. Singaila, Jessie Newman, Hanadaki Gaga, Deet Hoya Jad Ad Gakiels Kigawe, Deet Haida Ad Hiltsuk Ad Kwakwakiwak. Good morning. My name is Jessie Newman. I'm a Raven woman from the Skidans clan of Haida Gwaii. and I am Haida on my mother's side, and I am Hiltzik and Kwakwakiwak on my father's side. So that's just a bit of an intro in one of my native languages, Haida. I grew up in Skidegate, Haida Gwaii, a really small village on the south end of Haida Gwaii. Maybe there were 900 people. So I come from a very small community, which has definitely shaped me and who I am. I come from two fishing families, two very tight-knit families, and food absolutely brought us together and created so many connections. And so seeing that from a very young age definitely helped to help me become who I am and what I chose to do in my career. And also having that connection to my traditional foods through my father being a fisherman and all of my cousins and my uncles. It definitely was a huge part of my childhood and my upbringing, and just how it shaped me as an Indigenous person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like food has played a very large role for you growing up, and your close relationship with your family is in large part due to food practices and to eating. So I'm excited to hear more about that throughout the rest of the podcast episode. Thank you so much for sharing that. In keeping with the theme of our podcast series, and to wrap up introductions, the last question I want to ask you is, what is your favorite food and why?
So my favorite food is sockeye salmon. Um, it's probably one of the most important foods that we have as Indigenous peoples. And I just remember I have so many memories around it. Like, I love the taste, but I have so many memories surrounding sockeye, especially related to my dad and being together with my family on the Copper River. In Haida Gwaii, and just how it brings people together. And so even eating it now, of course I love the taste and it's incredible, but it brings so many memories to mind when I eat it. So that's definitely one of my favorite foods.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like food has so much meaning for you. It's not just simply about consumption and nutritional content, but it's about the community aspect, spending time with family members by the Copper River, and it sounds like it's a key part of your identity.
Absolutely. Like, I almost feel like the nutrition aspect to our foods, like, while important, is almost like the least important. And I feel like, yeah, just having access and consuming our foods and being connected to the land is just like the most important aspect of our foods, and not even so much the nutrition.
Definitely. I want to come back to how food is about connection to community and connection to the land. But first, to provide some context to our listeners, could you tell us about your role as a healthcare practitioner and which communities you currently work with?
So my role is quite unique in even the province of BC in that I mean, it's within the Indigenous health portfolio, and Island Health is the only health authority within the province that actually employs Indigenous health dietitians. So I do work as the Indigenous health dietitian with Island Health on the North Island, and the role is about a 50-50 mix of public health and community work. And so I work all over the North Island, basically the top half from Comox North. And I also support some nations on the mainland. And it's quite unique in that I don't actually see clients one-on-one. That's not part of my role, but I do a lot of group work in health centers, in Indigenous communities, and then also in schools as well. And then I do work with I do food systems work within a lot of networks on the island, but also provincially. So there's also like a policy aspect to my work and an advocacy role, supporting Indigenous peoples and Indigenous food sovereignty, as well as security. And my personal passion is diabetes prevention and management. And so That's something that I'm really passionate about, and it's such an issue in our communities. And um, so I would say that's like, if I could sum it up, that's what I do. But there's so much more to it, but it would just take so much time. And well, I support, I would say, maybe about 15 to 20 communities on northern Vancouver Island. Like sometimes I lose track, but it's mainly Kwakwaka'wakw communities on the eastern side of Vancouver Island. But I do support some northern New Chalmers communities, as well as some northern Coast Salish communities. So it's a lot. It's a big area. It's probably too big, but I enjoy it very much. And I get to travel a lot into some small communities that most people would just not have access to. So I feel very fortunate to do so.
Wow. Yeah, you have such a wide range of experiences, and to be able to work with so many different communities is so cool as well. What inspired you to pursue dietetics, and what was your path to actually getting there?
I was very inspired by my grandmother and my great aunt. They actually both had diabetes when I was growing up, and I had very little understanding of what it was when I was a child. I just remember like my parents and my aunties saying that they weren't allowed to have sweets because they had diabetes, but I had no idea how it was affecting their bodies. I don't think that they knew at all either. And I don't think that was something that was even really like taught or explained to them by healthcare providers within our communities, like being so remote, but also the racism that Indigenous peoples have to deal with within our health authorities, which is still an issue, but I definitely saw them struggle with that. I would say emotionally and mentally. Like I remember both of them like cheating or hiding sweets. And so it was very difficult. And then as I grew up and I learned the connection between nutrition and health outcomes and wellness, I knew that pursuing something related to food and wellness would be beneficial for me in supporting them. And as I got older, I do remember them starting to suffer some complications related to diabetes, and my great aunt especially, because I remember she smoked cigarettes pretty heavily when I was younger. And it got to a point where she had lost most of her vision and she had to move from Haida Gwaii to Vancouver for dialysis treatments. And I remember she had an infection on her leg and she was to have an amputation. And at a certain point, she was like, this is not a good quality of life. I miss my family. And she just ended up going back to Haida Gwaii and passing a few weeks later. And so that had a huge effect on me. And at that point, that's when I really knew that I wanted to pursue this. I wasn't a super sciencey student though. Like I remember, I also loved to write very much. And so I actually went into journalism for a year and realized like I just knew it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. And it took me maybe a few years to get the upgrading in science to get into dietetics because it's actually a pretty competitive program. And there's only one program in the province, which is at UBC. And so it took me a little bit, but thankfully I was successful. And yeah, it's been a bit of a roundabout journey, but I'm so happy to be here.
Wow. Wow. Well, yeah, it sounds like it was a bit of a roundabout journey, but I'm sure that every piece of the puzzle was necessary to get you to where you are today, especially what you're saying about kind of having this influence now in your role on food systems and policy and advocacy. I'm sure that having gone through some journalism, that provides you some tools to be able to advocate for patient populations.
I would say that's true, yeah, and I just feel so lucky, in that this role is so different than a typical, like, clinical dietitian in that I'm able to go into communities and meet people where they're comfortable, and obviously it makes a difference that I'm Indigenous and that I'm working with Indigenous peoples, and I've had some of the same experiences and, experience that collective trauma that we all feel as Indigenous peoples. And I think that makes such a difference. And there just are less guidelines on me in that I can spend the time with people and I don't have to see a certain amount of people a day in a regimented fashion, which feels luxurious and allows me to build relationship and trust, which is pretty key in my role.
Absolutely. Having a strong and trusting relationship with the patients you care for is critical, especially when you may be making dietary recommendations that hinge so much on patient compliance and adherence to a dietary plan. I mean, it makes sense to me too that sharing similar stories helps to build that relationship because you can understand to an extent what they might be going through and get to the nitty gritty of their condition.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that a lot of healthcare professionals don't. I mean, of course, they work in a system, and so there are guidelines, but I just don't think enough healthcare professionals put that emphasis on building a relationship, which I think is, I definitely recommend like trying to find the time for that because it's so important.
Do you find that you're able to get that time with individuals despite predominantly working in groups?
I am. I mean, I do. I find that, like, especially if I'm in smaller communities, I will sit down, in another room with people because um, there are just so many people who I know are struggling within the system and they don't have access to dietitians. And so, even though it's not like something that is supposed to be part of my role, I definitely will take the time in smaller communities to sit down with people and listen to them and offer advice because yeah, I just know that they're not getting the support that they need um, elsewhere within Island Health. So I will make exceptions, and I do. And yeah, thankfully, like the management within our Indigenous health portfolio are receptive to that.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's very admirable because of how important it is. Up until this point, we've hinted at the role of food and identity and wellness for Indigenous populations in particular, but I was wondering if you could directly address that topic and kind of sum up what we've touched upon so far.
So I've actually worked in my home community of Skidegate, and I mean, I guess that was the first 3 years of my career, and I've been on Northern Vancouver Island now for 6 years, and I think it's massive. I think it's so important. I know that food really connects us to each other. It connects us to our ancestors, and all of that happens on the land. And so often we don't have access to that, or there are policies that prevent us from really engaging with the land and our food systems. And I honestly do think most Indigenous people do struggle with identity and being Indigenous enough, especially if they grew up away from community or if they were not fortunate enough to have family members who have that knowledge of our foods and how to harvest them, which is a large proportion, I would say, of our population. And so just not having that access to land or actually being displaced from the land or placed onto reserves far away from our traditional hunting grounds. And I feel like I know so many Indigenous peoples as well who who had a mother who was Indigenous, who married a non-Indigenous, man who literally had to leave the reserve and grow up sometimes close by, but just being even if it's close, it was a very separate way of growing up and not having access to that knowledge. And so that has absolutely affected identity. But when I see people who are engaging with the land and our food systems, and who have that knowledge, you definitely get the sense that like they know who they are and they have that connection to our ancestors. And there's almost that feeling of like, this is who I am, this is what I was meant to be doing. And I think that has such an effect on like our spiritual wellness, but like our emotional, like it's just so holistic. And so that's where I'm going in my work. Like I want to take like that upstream approach and really try to find money for programs and support programs that are creating connections between youth and knowledge holders within the community, and getting out on the land and learning all of these ways of our ancestors. And I can't think of anything more important because everything is so connected. And like definitely growing up in that way with that connection to the land, like kids are going to have like a greater sense of like who they are and their identity and just overall like greater holistic wellness, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I think everything you've said makes total sense. I mean, if you can't access the land, if you don't have the knowledge on how to harvest or prepare traditional foods, or if you can't access community members who can teach you these cultural practices, you lose part of that shared identity, which harms your spiritual and emotional well being. You mentioned that you're trying to create support programs upstream to connect youth and community members that hold knowledge. Could you speak a bit more to the Knowledge Keepers program that you created in Kwakwakiwak?
Um, right. So I think it was almost 4 years ago. 4 years ago, actually. It was during COVID. And everybody was kind of getting freaked out. Like food was flying off the shelves, supply chains couldn't keep up. And a lot of our more remote communities, especially, were feeling it. And it was then that communities really wanted to put in an emphasis on creating like food security and enhancing food sovereignty. And so our portfolio, Indigenous Health, had some extra money and really wanted to support that because that's what they were hearing. And another group that I work with as well had some extra funds from the Community Food Action Initiative. And so, I mean, I've worked in Haida Gwaii. They have an amazing program around food security and sovereignty. So I saw that and I saw what made it successful. And there's other programs as well along the coast that are doing good things. But in order for that to happen, like there's always a community champion. And sometimes it's even just one, but that community champion is actually in a paid position and are actually being honored for their work and their time, which doesn't happen everywhere. But I mean, I'm starting to see a difference. And so just knowing that we actually needed to have positions like that, I propose that we create one or two positions on the island to focus specifically on creating programming that worked at creating those connections between youth and elders. But also, I mean, food sovereignty is different to everybody. So really just like letting them do what they want, based on what the needs of the community are and their areas. And so we created two positions, one in Kwakwakiwak territory and one in New Chalmouth territory. And they had completely different focuses. One was a bit more on the community garden and creating a greenhouse and then a pantry. And the other program was more focused on cultural mentorship and really creating connections between a knowledge holder in community who was pretty young. Like I remember I think he was in his like early 30s. The position has changed, but just a younger man to work at creating connections with youth in high school and taking them out on on trips like for harvesting traditional foods and yeah, like just being a great mentor to these kids. And it was incredible. Like some of them received their firearms licenses and killed their first deer, skinned their first deer. And so that was what I had envisioned in my mind when I was thinking of this. So I was like really stoked on that program. But there has been a third position created, I believe, within maybe 2 years later, and that's also in a new Chalmers community a little bit down south in a house. And it's an amazing, she's an amazing knowledge holder and has been working with a dietitian around creating like more traditional diabetes programming, which is really cool. Like I don't really know of anywhere else that has this type of programming, but yeah, she really lives the life of just so connected to the land, and so much of her diet is based on the seasons and just getting out there and really promoting this within the community and teaching this especially to youth and young girls in the community as a way of empowering them. And so I hope it grows. I definitely see that our health authority sees value in it, and it's just totally aligned with what we're hearing even provincially, that we really need to strengthen our local food systems and strengthen food sovereignty. Like that's really just the way forward, I believe.
It sounds like there are so many community leaders with so much knowledge to share. Amplifying the voices of these leaders and empowering them to build up their local food systems seems like the most logical step forward.
Well, yeah, and I mean, there have been a few reports created, a lot of engagement done with Indigenous communities, I would say within the past few years, like just based on what we've been hearing, and it's now a priority, which is exciting. And this is what we're hearing from community, and a lot of us that are working within these more remote communities are trying to really amplify their voices and raise it forward. And so yeah, like we're actually starting to like sense that there's a shift in that like this type of work is going to hopefully expand. Like I would love this to be all over the island. And I actually am seeing that some nations are employing like food security specialists within their communities. And so I mean that's nice, but I would also like to see these positions funded externally as well, so that nations aren't having to do this by themselves. And yeah, like it's really creating connections between communities, more remote communities, Indigenous communities, and connecting them to like food hubs within the province. And so this type of programming, yeah, it's really great. It's creating so many connections within the food system, which is amazing. Like connections to farmers, to the food hubs, to dietitians, and yeah, I've seen like so much growth, I would say, within the past 6 years since I've been here.
Right. Given that you only have three knowledge keeper positions, how do you choose? Um, I'm sure there's so many leaders and communities that have expertise. Is there an application process? What does that selection look like?
A lot of it was just through the relationships that I had within community. Like I don't think you could build anything without having that foundation and those relationships with with health centers and with community members. And so a lot of it was just like word of mouth and having conversations with people that I was working with in community. And some of them I already knew, but like some of them were just through having conversations. And yeah, like it was challenging at first, but because the way that the funding came about, like it just um, so at the end of each fiscal year, there's money that has to go out within a certain timeline. So I remember there just being like this huge rush to get it out. So it was a bit of a challenge. But with this third one, we were able to be a bit more selective and had even more conversations with people that were working in the community. Like I think there were maybe 6 or 7 of us that got together who were working in food. There were a few dietitians, people that were working with the regional districts, and we all had our networks and we had a few conversations, and we all kind of knew that there was this one person who's just amazing. And so it all came back, we all came back to her and we're like, okay, let's ask her. And lucky enough for us, she was on board and continues to be, and was instrumental in us putting together Indigenous Foods Gathering in this last March, and it was amazing. And yeah, so we're very fortunate to have her.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thing. I mean, somebody with such a high level of knowledge and expertise, I'm sure has a lot on their plate. So for her to agree to be part of this project and to help you guys move forward, is really, really wonderful.
Absolutely. We all feel so fortunate, and she just has so many connections up and down the coast. And yeah, so I hope she does end up staying in this role for the foreseeable future. And yeah, I think we all feel like so blessed.
For sure. I guess sort of moving on to another part of our conversation. We've touched on food and land access and how food and land are so intricately intertwined, as well as how policy can affect how food and land is accessed. I wanted to touch a bit more on the role of colonization and colonial policies, including residential schools and the reserve system, in creating poor health outcomes in Indigenous communities today.
Okay, it's very complex. There's so many moving parts, and I think residential school especially has probably had the greatest impact, and that has been in disrupting that knowledge transfer from parents to children, from grandparents to children. I mean, it definitely wasn't completely lost, but so much of that knowledge was lost. And so that is definitely one of the biggest factors that has affected outcomes, because we just don't have access to our foods anymore. And we don't have that social connection and network within the community that we once had when, back in the day, like everyone within the community had a role, and so much of our lives were really built around foods and food sources and the seasons, and really like traveling around our territories based on that. And so there used to be like so much more of a connection within the community. And so that has been lost, not completely, like it's definitely coming back. There's a bit of a resurgent with these programs, and it's happening everywhere. Like I'm starting to see it, which is very exciting. But yeah, so the residential schools definitely have affected things, and that knowledge aspect, but the reserve systems as well. Many communities that I work with have been severely displaced from their traditional territories, where they have hunted and fished for thousands of years. And that was completely intentional. And so not having access or just being so far from those areas which are hard to access for most people, especially if they don't have boats or the money to access, and then these policies as well, which prevent people from fishing and hunting in the way that they used to. Park systems which have been built on Indigenous land, which prevent Indigenous peoples from engaging in their food systems. Um, so that loss of access and then that loss of knowledge has really affected our health, because we don't have access to those foods, which of course, they have that nutrition, but then we've lost that knowledge, which has affected our identity, and and then all of that trauma that was experienced within residential schools, which has been passed down through the generations. It continue, residential schools, they've been closed for a while, but they still continue to affect our communities based on these cycles of trauma, which are passed down. And if people aren't able to cope or process that trauma, it definitely gets passed down. And so that's still a huge problem within our community. That traumas are affecting our mental health, our emotional wellness, really all aspects of our wellness. And when people have experienced that and they haven't found ways to cope, they become very depressed. And when people are in that state, they don't want to take care of their wellness. And so, um, and then if you couple that with like the poverty that many people are experiencing within our communities, being so remote, not having access to education or employment. All of these things come together and can create conditions where people really don't care about themselves. And they've heard these things in residential school. Like I've heard people say, like, I was continuously told that I was worthless. And when people hear that time and time again, they start to believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rate couple that with the racism that people feel within society. So you can imagine that all of these things just can create a bit of a downward spiral sometimes, and also like start to affect your identity. And so this is why we have all of these health outcomes. It has to do with the history and what happened. And I'm not sure that many healthcare professionals understand that. But this is really why we're in this situation that we are today, and why so many Indigenous peoples just disproportionately are affected by diabetes and other poor health outcomes. And but I do feel that having access to our foods and getting out onto the land and engaging with the land and creating connections within community is a great path forward. So I don't want it to be all doom and gloom. Like all of these things from due to colonialism have affected our lives very negatively, but I do see engaging with our culture and our foods as and really like just living and trying to practice those things that we did when we were at peace as really like, I mean, I keep saying it, but it really is the path forward. Like um those things that we had done, those are the things that we really need to be focusing on, which can be difficult, but trying to really create programming within community that focuses on these things.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think like you say, you don't want to be doom and gloom, but I actually don't think it's doom and gloom. It's so critical for people to understand that, you know, somebody's health and well-being doesn't just come down to the choices that they're deciding to make. it comes down to all of these social and economic and political barriers that they face. And specifically, from what I'm hearing from what you said for Indigenous populations, it comes down to that history of colonialism
Mhm.
and what you were saying about residential schools and individuals being told that they're worthless and, being told you're worthless. Well, what's the point then in trying to maintain your health and, trying to spend money on foods that are considered healthy or nutritional or of nutritional value? I guess one thing that I'm curious about is you mentioned that that individual individuals are unable to access um, foods, and you mentioned barriers like cost or policies that prevent fishing and hunting practices or parks on Indigenous land. How can people regain access?
I think it has a lot to do with advocacy. And I mean, one thing that I am certain of is what our country has tried to do is really separate us from the land, because they knew that if we were disconnected from the land, that we would be less willing to fight for it. When people have that strong connection with the land and they grow up on the land, um, they are willing to really, really fight for it. And so, I mean, I've seen changes even within the last few months where Haida Gwaii, my home communities have have really fought for control and over their land, which is very exciting. And without having to go through the treaty process. And so, I mean, sometimes it can just be getting out onto areas that are close by. Like I sometimes go out just on the back roads, and I'm mostly into plant harvesting, so that's what I do. That's what I have access to. So if you aren't into advocacy, there is that aspect as well, like just getting out onto areas that are close by, because I think even that can have such a huge effect on your mental health and well-being. And then even trying to find a knowledge holder in community and connecting with them and seeing if they will give you some of your time, but also advocating within your community for programming like this and to create positions like this. I know that most communities do, or most programs and health centers do take direction from community, and as well as the First Nations Health Authority and our portfolio as well. And so if this is something that is being heard in community, I do think it makes a difference.
For sure, for sure. No, that's very good advice. Thank you so much again for sharing that. Um, Sort of pivoting, because we've spoken a lot about colonialism and colonial influence on Indigenous diet. Just to contrast that, I wanted to speak a bit more about what food security and sovereignty looks like for the Indigenous communities that you've worked in. I know earlier you mentioned that food sovereignty looks different to everybody, which is why I just thought we could focus on some of the experiences that you've had.
Yeah, like absolutely. I would never want to give like a big definition on food sovereignty, but I think a lot of it is just like really trying to get out onto the land as much as you can. And um, like, because food sovereignty really has a lot to do with, I would say, control and management over our own resources and creating a food system that makes sense to us. And so I think it would be important for communities to get together and really decide what food sovereignty means for them and how they want to go about that. I don't think that people can just really decide for themselves. I do think it takes a community effort, and that also creates connection within the community, and try to find a bit of a consensus of what food sovereignty means to us and how are we going to go about managing our resources in a way that feels good to us? And like in Haida Gwaii, in my community of Skidegate, that's something that is really done collectively by the Council of the Haida Nation, especially for our sockeye runs, which have just, it's kind of happening right now, actually. The community decides together whether there are actually enough sockeye to harvest, or if they have to wait, or if we need to put limits on it, because we want to make sure that this resource is sustainable, and because we rely on it so much, it's so important to us. And so I think deciding collectively as a community is probably the most important thing that communities could do. And that's something that we did when we hosted the traditional foods gathering. It was hosted on Nuu-chah-nulth territory. And so we really wanted to know from the people that attended, which were over 200, like, what does food sovereignty mean to you? What is important? What do you want to see? So I definitely think coming together and creating connections and deciding how communities want to define it and how they want to manage their resources is probably the first step in food sovereignty.
Okay. And I'm hearing again kind of the sentiment of community building and networking and that opportunity to come together, that food creates that opportunity in many ways.
Exactly. And so, and that really is the point of the Indigenous food gathering, is to create connections with people within nations all over the island, um, and to create like a bit of a sense of belonging. And um, it's really amazing. Like when people gather, things really happen. And so there were so many connections made within that, and connections that we hope to keep up, and those networks. And so that's the goal overall, to have these yearly meetings, but also to have kind of mini gatherings over the island over the course of the year to keep these connections strong.
Definitely. And are these meetings being held in a location that's accessible for anybody and everybody to get to, or do you think there's room for improvement or perhaps virtual spaces to make sure that everybody's voice is heard?
We have been thinking about virtual voices. So the gathering that happened in March, it was in Port Alberni, which is kind of the most central location we could think of. And it pretty much is on Vancouver Island. And we paid for people's travel and hotel to come. Like, we really wanted to remove as many barriers as possible.
Mhm.
Going forward, we are thinking of some virtual events. A lot of communities were focused on emergency planning, and then building food sovereignty. And so the plan is to try to create some virtual events, and the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council also have their own monthly virtual gatherings for food sovereignty. And so trying to keep that momentum going in any way that we can. But like, funds are always a big issue, and so that might end up being the barrier, but that's definitely the goal, to try to keep the connection strong.
That's awesome. I was curious to know if there was a way to facilitate participation, so that's great to hear your considerations. Those are the majority of my questions for today. I've just got one more kind of focused on the future and next steps. Could you describe to the audience what you think are some pressing, outstanding needs when it comes to diet and food access for Indigenous communities in BC?
Um, so I definitely think that we need to build stronger local food systems and really raise up that traditional knowledge within community. So definitely trying to find more funding for like knowledge holders, or traditional foods activators within communities. I think it would be amazing to have somebody in schools that could teach these things to youth. I think there should be maybe somebody in every school within the province. It makes sense to me because we lost so much of this knowledge within residential school. It kind of makes sense that it is something that should be taught within schools and probably be inclusive. But like one of the biggest barriers that I'm seeing in community is just not having the capacity to take this on because there are a lot of grants. So there are, there's definitely money for this, but there's not really the capacity in communities. So really trying to create these positions within community and dispersing those funds within community so that these positions can be created. The money is great, but the whole granting process, I think it doesn't make sense to me. Like the application process, the reporting process, like that's such a barrier for communities. I think it just makes much more sense instead of like having all of these grants and employing all of these settlers in these positions to disperse the grants. It
Mhm.
just makes sense to give the money to communities and let them do what they would like to do. Um, and create these positions to really like further food sovereignty, and yeah, like creating more food processing facilities within communities, especially if they're a bit more remote, so that they're just things don't have to be outsourced because I know so many communities, especially on the West Coast, they will bring like deer and elk to butchers on the East Coast to be processed, but it would be so great if they had like their own facilities within their communities. And I think a lot of them really are looking at this. Like I've heard of two communities on in the north, Kwakwakiwak area that are looking to create these. So um, yeah, like I've really been blown away by what's happening, but like I just think it would be so great to remove the whole granting process and just disperse the money to communities and let them do what they would like.
Yeah,
That's self-determination, like that's food sovereignty. That's yeah, so I think that would be my greatest recommendation.
absolutely. You mentioned earlier that locus of control and that it's important for food security and sovereignty to be in the hands of Indigenous populations rather than the settler who hands out grants and distributes the money how they see fit.
Exactly. Like it just feels very paternalistic to me. It always has, even within our own island health, our portfolios that disperse them. Like it just feels, yeah, very paternalistic. And I always feel that the money should go directly to Indigenous peoples and programs need to be Indigenous led. And we don't need settlers trying to um, like tell our communities what to do or um, focused on reporting or just anything really. Like we just need our Indigenous peoples to be in control of their food systems and have access to the land to do so.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us here on the podcast today. I think my biggest takeaway personally is to focus locally on food systems and come up with creative ways to facilitate knowledge transfer between generations, passing that knowledge down.
That is perfect. I think that was what I wanted to the takeaway really to be like a lot of it has to do with control, but also really focusing on youth and really ensuring that they are growing up with this knowledge. I think it just will make such it'll have such an effect on our wellness and our health outcomes in the future.
Definitely. Well, those are all of the questions that I have for you today, Jessie. So that's a wrap. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I found our conversation to be truly insightful and inspiring.
Well, hello for having me, Kennedy.